Hey everybody, welcome back, and once again, thank you for joining me. This week's video is all about cliches and how to avoid them. About 7 years ago, I was at a writers' conference, and it was being hosted by Andre Dubus III. And I remember at the time, he gave a nice little speech about sort of his writing experiences and what aspiring authors should be looking to do. And one of the core things he talked about right from the get-go was, that's funny, I actually used a cliche right there, unplanned. But one of the things he had spoken about in the lecture was that when he had first queried agents and he was looking for them for his first book, the agent basically had told him right away that if there's any cliches at all in your book, I'm going to stop. The moment I see a cliche in your work, just one overused statement, one sort of figure of speech that has been done over and over again, I'm going to stop. I am going to put your book down and I will move on to somebody else. And I remember thinking at the time, wow, that is immense. To have a whole manuscript and not to have one cliche, not any sort of figure of speech that's been done before, that was very daunting for me. But it was also very eye-opening. It was something that after the event was over, I went home and really focused on. Removing cliches and trying to write prose that it was as original in thought as possible really became my focus for about the next year. That was kind of my central idea, was to get rid of anything that seemed to be cliched or anything that seemed to be weak in my prose. So I hope that anecdote has helped to understate the necessity of getting rid of cliches. I know there are times when we write and we don't even recognize that we're putting them in our work, but they can't be there. It's not one of those things that you can really pass off and kind of hope it slips under the proverbial rug. Again, another cliche right there. It's really something that you need to focus on and to try to eliminate as much as possible. And again, ideally have none in your work. As difficult as it can be, I'm going to have a couple tips right here to help you out. So with that out of the way, let's get into it. Here are going to be a few tips to help you remove cliches from your writing. Tip number 1 is going to be specificity. Vague language is going to be the death of your prose. This is not just for cliches, but really just weak writing in general. If your writing is weak, it's often because you're not being specific with your writing and you're not saying what you're actually trying to say. A good example of this could be having a scene open with a man in his 60s sitting down at the breakfast table and reading the newspaper. In and of itself, sitting down at the breakfast table and reading newspaper is not a bad thing. It's a bit of a cliche for sure. It's been shown time and time again in movies and also in novels as well. But that in and of itself is not necessarily bad. The problem is the vagueness of it. You need to go deeper with the work. You need to be more specific with the writing. Let's revisit that scenario again. A man in his 60s sits down at the breakfast table and they begin reading the New York Post. Just by identifying what the newspaper is and not just writing the newspaper, but actually getting into what it is, tells you a bit more about the character. You'll just by the type of newspaper they're reading, you would know more about their values. If it's the New York Post or say the New York Times, you'll probably be able to guess the character's general political beliefs. The point here is specificity. It's to be more detailed. It's labeling what you're doing and what your characters are doing. The more vague you are, the weaker the writing is. This is often why someone who writes from their own experiences, someone who writes perhaps fictional characters that have experienced the same sort of childhood traumas or the same challenges with their upbringing, often write very good prose. It's because they know the environment. They can be very specific in the details. They can write almost exactly how a character would react to these scenarios. They don't need to rely upon vagueness because they've lived it. They just happen to know it. It's very easy. There's not a whole lot of research required to understand your character and to know this well. Specificity is the cure for cliche. The second tip is to avoid the first ideas that come to you. We've all been there. We've been at the keyboard and we've got a nice word count going. We're in a nice flow state and we just start cranking out words and sentences that sort of just come to us. They're the first ideas that come off the top of our head. However, at least for myself, and if you notice too, you'll probably find out that many of the things that you write when they just sort of flow from you tend to be a bit weak. The ideas aren't very original, and the dialogue or the prose you're using can be cliched. The reason for this is that you're relying upon the first ideas that come to you. Our brains are a bit unique in that often the idea that is the most cliched is the thing that's going to be at the forefront of your brain. Humans are lazy. Our minds are very, very lazy, and so we want to recall the most common thing first to simply save us the effort and the work of having to go deeper. And so often the first ideas that come to you are the cliched ones. They're the things that you've seen all the time, or the ideas that come to you all the time. As such, I'd encourage you to spend a bit more time going deeper with your work, to really consider what you're putting on the page, to perhaps take your initial idea, put it to the side, and then challenge yourself to go deeper. Ask yourself, okay, that's an all right turn of phrase, but can we do better? Or ask yourself, that's an okay scene, but I've probably seen this scene a million times in films, and let's see if I can make it a bit more original. Let's see if I can include things that are a little newer. Writing that comes from the top of your head is often some of the worst writing that you're going to have. This is what makes writing difficult, and this is what makes really good novelists pretty rare. It requires a good deal of effort to go through and to take your initial ideas, put them to the side, and really evaluate, does this belong there? Does this actually need to be in the piece? This is also why your professor back in high school would often dissect entire scenes of description in those lit books and make every single scene need to have its own symbolism. The author had the walls described as the color blue to symbolize the depression of the main character. To all the teenagers that are in the classroom, obviously they're probably thinking, well, no, he might have just wanted to have blue walls just because. But for the more experienced novelist, you'll realize that everything you put into your novel needs to have a reason, or ideally it should. You're making plenty of decisions about your book, and every single small decision will influence the totality of it. And it's this gravity and the nuance required and the meticulous way you make these decisions that makes your book strong. And that's how you avoid these cliches. Monomaniacal focus on your work is paramount to avoiding them. All right, and lastly, the third tip to avoid cliches is to make your metaphors specific to the character. A good figure of speech can be excellent, but to make them stand out and to avoid the trap of the cliche, you simply want to make those metaphors and those similes relevant to your character and your character's experience. For example, I'm currently working on editing my second novel, and the opening paragraph actually has a turn of phrase. In the initial draft of it, I used the expression nose to the grindstone, which is a very well-known cliche. During the revision process, I decided to keep that turn of phrase in there, but to modify the actual phrase to something that would be relevant to the character. The character is from New England and from the upper Northeast, and so I decided to change the expression nose to the grindstone to maw to the stump. For those that maybe don't know, a splitting maw is just an axe that you use to cut wood. The meaning is the same thing, but now, using the expression maw to the stump instead of nose to the grindstone, I've created a whole new turn of phrase. It is no longer a cliched phrase, but in fact, it's a unique one that is unique to the character. It's something that the character would say. It's a thought they would actually have. And so for yourself, when you go back through some of these cliched phrases or comparisons or metaphors, you don't always need to outright eliminate them. You can keep the meaning behind them, but simply change the metaphor around to something that is relevant to your character. This requires a little bit of research and a little bit of know-how, obviously. If you don't know your character, if you don't know their environment, don't know their world very well, you may not be able to do this, and that's more of an indication that you should do more research and more understanding of your character. But if you do, this can be a great way to keep the same meaning and also save you a little bit of time by just coming up with a bit of a reversal and a bit of a change into how the expression is said. All right. And that's it. So those are a couple tips to help you avoid cliches. Again, I want to reiterate that you really need to strive to eliminate them altogether from your work. It's not just bad writing, but as I said at the beginning, it's something that if you're looking for traditional publishing can be a big detriment, especially if it's something that you submit very early on. If it is in those first few pages there that you send off, it's likely that an agent could pass on you. People want to see originality. They want to see strong writing, and cliches often are the epitome of bad writing. And so with that, if you've enjoyed it and you found this helpful, please give it a thumbs up, and I will see you all next week.